Great, thank you so much. Okay, so you can hear me okay. Yeah, so this talk is about laws and relations between quantities. I think originally it was titled Laws Are Relations Between Quantities. If anyone has a preference between them, let me know, I'm neutral. And so roughly what I'm going to try to do is construct a synthesis of the Armstrong account of laws and the primitivist account of laws. So the first thing I'm going to do is just do an outline of some of the commitments of anti-Humeanism and sort of where I think we should think of that debate as ending us up at. And hopefully I'll have presented this in a way that will maybe not be extremely boring for those of you who are super aware of this literature already. Then I'm going to outline some of the theoretical building blocks that I'm using to construct this account. These two things called the characteristic instance template and the legal relation. And then after that, I'll actually outline the view and then describe a couple of the worries about the view, ways that you can fix that, and what I think are its theoretical advantages. Cool. Sound good? Everybody can hear me? I'm going to assume yes. People walking in, give a thumbs up. You're doing all the things. Okay, good. I'm assuming that means it's good. Great. So laws of nature, and in particular, physical sciences are really kind of weird. So they're simultaneously wide-ranging and universal, but are also extremely specific and discerning. So they apply everywhere and every when. So when the laws have to do with some particular event, they apply to all events of that type. Right? So an object falling towards the Earth, diamonds are refracting in a particular way. It's not just that particular object or that particular diamond, but all of them. But they're extremely picky, even though they apply to these specific events and therefore to these large generalities. They care a whole lot about really, really specific features of those events. So the laws of gravitation are wholly insensitive to an object's color. When determining the kind of forces it's under, the laws of refractive index famously don't care whether or not the diamond is in the line Kimberlite. It is this feature which has invited comparisons to other things in our understanding of the world, things like rules laid down by the government and universal generalizations of expressed objective logic. So, rules laid down by the government, laws in the literal sense, they apply to everyone equally, but they are also specific, right? They don't care what you have for breakfast to determine if you'll get pulled over for going 95 on I-95. All that matters is the speed, right? So specific, it's picking out one specific characteristic of that event to determine if it's a law breaking event or not. Likewise, universal generalizations are exactly like this, where they are, in one sense, just claims about the entire world, right? They claim of the entire world that this particular material conditional holds, but there's the only non-trivial content that it has, the only content that it has that doesn't just follow from like the falsehood of FA in this case, is this much more specific and narrow claim, which is why we often characterize it as saying all F's are G's, despite the literal meaning being something like all things are such that if F then G. Cool. Should be pretty obvious to you, but to give you like an idea of what's going on here. The anti-Humean approach can be understood then as a choice to recognize this connection, but also resist the temptation to identify lawhood with the truth, usefulness, or best systematizingness of some universal generalization. Likewise, to resist identifying it with any kind of metaphysical version of the laws of the land if we don't want to go some sort of theistic way. Trotsky very famously objected to the regularity account because universal generalizations do not distinguish between coextensive predicates, so they are not, even though they are universal and picky, they are not quite as picky as laws of nature are. So the direct equally Armstrong account can be understood as taking the natural language laws of the universal generalization, all F's or G's, seriously. So, and the idea is roughly that what is actually being described when we say all F's or G's is some relationship between Fness and genus themselves. rather than some relation between all the entities in the world, or even just all the actually existing ones that happen to instantiate F, right? It's something about the properties themselves, something about F and G on their own. And the idea is that by making it about relations between properties, we are able to recapture the universality and pickiness that's so distinctive about laws. The universal redness is wholly present in every instance of a red thing. It's a universal, so we call them that. But at the same time, when you are determining if the law applies, if the law is just about the relations between these universals, then the only thing that matters for any given event is whether that universal is instantiated. Or I guess whether both are instantiated if you're determining if it's a lawful event that's in keeping with the laws. And so it's got both the universality and pickiness. The Armstrong version of the DTA account introduces a second order relation, which is itself a universal, called the necessitation relation, where NXY means roughly that instances of the universal X necessitate instances of the universal Y, so whenever X obtains of something, Y obtains also of it or of other things in the vicinity. So the law, all F's or G's, obtains just in case F and G stand in this necessitation relation. There are a bunch of problems that are very well known that the DTA account faces. But there's one that specifically stands out as, I think, really, really damaging and hard to work past without kind of losing the whole account. And it's one I didn't really take very seriously until sort of recently. And so this is the Lewis quote from New Work for Theory of Universals, where he makes what's sometimes called the Armstrong objection. And says, whatever n may be, I cannot see how it could be absolutely impossible to have NFG and FA without GA. I say that N deserves the name of necessitation only if somehow it really can enter into the requisite necessary connections. It can't enter into them just by bearing the name, any more than one can have mighty biceps just by being called Armstrong, right? So this is a really serious objection, and it's one that I always thought, it's like, yeah, you just kind of like, you can get out of it pretty quick, but let me explain at least why this is, why this on its face is really serious, and why ways to get around it are not able to retain the things that made the DTA account good. So what this objection means is that the main benefit of the Drexel-Armstrong account, which is that it could explain the characteristics of laws by identifying them with relations between universal, evaporates. Right? You have none of that benefit. There's no explanatory benefit at all. Turns out relations between universals simply can't do that job. And this is the part where that I only fully appreciated relatively recently, which is that the default answer to this, to stipulate that the N relation is a necessitation relation, that it imposes the right necessary connection, will not get you out of this problem. And the reason is because, again, the DTA account is supposed to explain how laws have their modal and explanatory force, their universality and pickiness, how they ground counterfactuals, via this identification with relations between universals. To stipulate our way out of this is to concede that the laws being relations to universals actually has nothing to do with any of those things. Actually, it's just this stipulation. And so what we end up with is a kind of dilemma, because why bother with all of this extra rigmarole about relations and universals at all? Why not just include the stipulation as your only view? And that is primitivism, right? So primitivism about laws can be understood as emerging from the unsatisfying tension in that answer to the inference problem, which is that once you answer the inference problem with a stipulation, there's no reason to keep all the extra stuff. So identifying laws with universals can't do the job. Our theory of laws won't explain why they play those roles except by stipulation, so let's just have only stipulation. So for a typical primitive view, a law of nature is a sui generis entity that has such and such motor profile, plays such and such a role in the evolution of the physical state over time, serves to support counterfactuals and other right explanations, etc. Why? Because. And for some primitivists, they might say a little bit more. Maudlin says that laws are fundamental laws of temporal evolution, but it doesn't say a lot more than that as to like what their inner structure or nature is like. And the disagreements between different kinds of primitivism are not disagreements really about the metaphysics of the laws. They're disagreements about what specific role laws play in the world, what roles we should take as kind of fundamental versus what roles are sort of emergent from them playing those other roles. So again, Maudlin taking the evolution of the physical state over time as this kind of fundamental thing, and then taking other things like motor profile and counterfactuals as being grounded in that. A big pro of this, we avoid the inference problem immediately, right? If the thing that's defined as that thing which I have said must be the one that acts like the laws is good for anything, it's that it does what the laws are supposed to do, including have those necessary connections. The big con is that we lose all the explanatory, kind of intuitive benefits of the DPA account. So if you wanted to be able to say the laws act like this because blank, the DPA account gives you a clear way to finish that sentence, right? They do it because there are relations between physical properties and so on and so forth. There is nothing in the primitivist account that you get to say at the end of that because, other than maybe, a full stop, right? The laws behave thus and so, the laws impart necessary connections because. Why can't the primitivist say more? Why couldn't they add more to the story? And this is what I call a sort of quietist revenge problem. For a primitivist deciding to posit any extra metaphysical gadget, they're going to face a dilemma. Either you run into a revenge version of the inference problem, which if this metaphysical gadget is important to explaining how the laws govern, then it's going to be open to a new inference problem, Armstrong objection. Right? If you add something in there and it plays an essential role in explaining how the laws do what they do, then you're going to be able to run the same sort of story as to why really there is no connection between that and what the laws do except the stipulation. But if it's not part of explaining how the laws govern, then this new metaphysical gadget is just extraneous window dressing. Right? In which case then, from parsimony alone, we should be cutting it. So, for the primitivist about laws of nature, any extra metaphysical commitments over and above the governing assumption can't be very important to the viewer. And so the bare bones primitivist account will almost always win on balance relative to any other way of fleshing it out. And that makes me at least feel better as to understanding why the primitivist accounts feel like that. That it's not just a characteristic of the people who defend them, that there really is something about the view that demands you stop talking about what the laws are like. Great. So, can we avoid this quiet revenge problem? So the problem of quietism is not a problem if you like the bare bones accounts, or if you like the accounts of Maudlin or Carroll, or whichever primitivists you prefer. It's only one that matters if you care about having that extra intuitive explanatory appeal that the anti-Humean accounts, which is one where the explanation came from the ability to identify the laws of nature with some other thing in the world and use the structure of that thing as part of the explanation. A couple options as to avoid this. One is to just give up the anti-Humean law story and become a dispositionalist or a power theorist. Much more flexible in what you're able to say the world is like, but this is just rejecting primitivism about laws. You're not really giving a theory of lawhood, you're giving a theory of other things in the world, and then if you have a theory of lawhood, it might be something separate. It could even be something Humean in the way that Demarest has that, has this account of the Humean laws that apply to a world with a bunch of dispositions in it. Solution 2 would be to retain primitivism, but change the governing assumption in a way that lets you avoid the quiet revenge problem. The con is, of course, given what I just said about the fire events problem, it's unclear how you even do that. The pro is that it's not going to be unclear for very long about how you have to do that. So now I'm going to tell you how to do that. The account I'm about to present will retain much of the structure of the direct completely Armstrong account, but it will employ a primitivist style governing assumption, which, to be fair, I mean, even by what is the law of nature, Armstrong is doing that, so still it's within the realm of what a DTA account should be like. But I will not be using universal generalizations, my guide to the structure of laws. Rather, we'll be using the actual laws of nature as they appear in our physical theories. So with the go-to simplest example that we'll use as being F equals NA. On this account, laws are relations between properties, but specifically between universal physical quantities, and they are not relations of necessitation. Rather, laws are relations of proportionality. This is going to, should hopefully, at least immediately, if you're very bought into this, the inverse problem, you should immediately start going, well, they're not relations of necessitation. How are you going to get the necessitation? Good, you should be continuing to worry about that. So primitives about laws stipulate that the laws make contact in the world with a certain way. We call that the governing assumption, the assumption that the laws govern the state of the world. This is a primitive posit. It's not meant to be explained in terms of other things. Let me just say right now, I will not be positing some new fancier version of NFG and adding a plus the laws govern clause at the end. Right? I'm not going to be merging primitivism and the DTA account in that way. We're going to be doing something a little more subtle. So, how do we get around this dilemma between this quietism and the inference problem? And the answer is to build the governing assumption into your laws in the right way, specifically kind of from the ground up. For the structure of laws to be able to do any explanatory work, the governing assumption must be deeply mixed into that structure. It can't just be added on the end or included as a separate clause. If we're understanding this like making a cake, governing has to be the baking powder, not the icing. On this account, the governing assumption operates what I call, via a relation I call the legal relation, which we'll get to in a second. Super brief preview of what the legal relation is. Highlight some types of events as in keeping with the laws, and it will say that a particular event is legal or an instance of the law, just in case this relation holds between certain properties that are instantiated in that relation. So laws to me are not statements or propositions. We can't understand them as holding in any way. We can't understand them as having instances. One of the purposes of the legal relation is to allow us to let laws kind of make contact with the world in the way that things like universal generalizations are able to do so by having semantic content that refers to it. The legal relation will let this metaphysical gadget have something to do with all of the actual events that occur in the world. Great. Okay. I'm going to quick outline some of the theoretical building blocks that will be relevant to the rest of the account. Quick basic concepts: what the quantity, and understanding as things like mass, charge, length, force strength, distance, spin. And I'm going to use the terms quantity to mean typically that will be short for a determinable quantity. And then I'll either say a determinate value or a determinate magnitude for some specific value of that quantity. And the only thing that will be super relevant to us is that magnitudes of a given quantity stand in ratio relations. So we say that 12 kilograms is 3 times as much as 4 kilograms, and so the mass ratio between 12 kilograms and 4 kilograms is 3 to 1. We can represent that with a relation that n to 1 in mass is the name of that relation, so we would say that the mass ratio between x and y is n to 1. That's just a purely metaphysics of quantity thing, not related to our laws directly. Now here are 2 pieces of our kind of laws. First is a characteristic instance template, which is a lot of words for just basically a event type with some blanks in it. The specific event type that the characteristic instance template corresponds to will be dependent on what law you're talking about. So in the case of F equals ma, the characteristic instance of F equals ma is going to be a physical event type involving a massive body that accelerates after being impressed by a force. That thing is a template in the sense that the template is one that does not specify the force it's under, the mass of the body, how much the body accelerates in response to the mass. It's only the kind of the rest of those things taken together. Then the legal relation is a law that takes a law and a characteristic instance template, and it tells you if a given ordered list of magnitudes satisfies the law when filled into those blanks. Right? So to say that x, y, and z, where x is an acceleration, y is a mass, and z is a force strength, is legal for F equals ma, is just to say that that a body of mass y accelerating at rate x after being impressed by force z is a legal instance or a genuine instance or just an instance of F equals ma. That's what the legal relation is. It tells you if a fully specified event is in accordance with the law. And again, a lot of this extra cruft is just coming from the fact that we need to be able to spell out what it means for laws to have instances in a world where the laws aren't anything like universal generalizations, and so there's no way to read off their instances from the notes without them. Great. So that's what the legal relation is. It just tells you for a given trio of determinate, mass, acceleration, and force values, whether they satisfy F equals ma. Legal is a powerful relation that lets us capture how the law makes contact with the world, sort of solves that problem that we lost by giving up the account of laws as being as involving necessitation or as involving universal generalization. We get some of that back with legal. We can understand how the laws apply to all of those things. X, y, and z, when plugged into the characteristic instance template of F equals ma, will yield a genuine instance of that law, and so we'll say that the short method is to say that X, Y, Z is legal with respect to L. On this view, an instance of a law can now just be defined, or an event is a legal instance, that an instance is just a saturation of the characteristic instance template that satisfies legal. Or a saturation with a ordered list of magnitudes that taken together satisfy legal. Great. Maybe it strikes you kind of weird in this area, but we'll see why it matters. For the laws to govern the world is just going to be understood as meaning that all instances of the characteristic instance template must be legal, or that is to say that they must be part of a legal event. So that is every time some massive thing is impressed by a force and accelerates, it must be that in addition to being that more general thing, it has to be a more specific kind of event that satisfies legal. So consider an Newtonian world where a particle of mass 1 kilogram is entering a field that imposes a 2 Newton force in some direction. For F equals ma to govern is for it to make it such that this state evolves into a legal instance of F equals ma. So in this case, that means that the law would make it such that the particle accelerates at 2 meters per second squared in the direction of that force. That's all that means. So again, all of this right here is our governing assumption. We are stipulating this the same way that a primitivist would. Now the question is why, if we're allowed to stipulate this for legal, is the structure of the laws not going to be an empty metaphysical gadget? And the reason is because so far we've only been looking at particular determinate magnitudes of each quantity, and there are potentially, under most ways of understanding the physical world, continue many of those for each of the quantity. So on its own, if we only have one, that's not going to tell us very much. And so the ways that the structure of the laws will matter is by determining the distribution of the equal relation. Okay, well, it's still working. So on this picture, the laws of nature are relations between the determinable quantities, not between the determinants. So the legal is a relation between determinate magnitudes. The laws of nature are relations between the quantities themselves. So like big M, mass, and big A, acceleration, based on whether they're determinate magnitudes, things like 2 kilograms and 1.556 meters per second squared, stand in the legal relation with the corresponding force vector. So what do I mean by saying these count as proportionality relations? Is that different from ratio relations? And the answer is yes, but it's very closely related. So it's not just about whether the magnitudes of these quantities stand in a legal relation. The laws also refer to ratio relations between magnitudes of the same quantity as conditions for the distribution of the legal relation. Here's an example of a proportionality relation. This is just a way of writing out the statement that mass and acceleration are inversely proportional in F equals ma, so give people a chance to look at that. So what this says is that for a given law L, I don't know what this is, for a given law L, if A1, M1, and F are a legal trio, then for any other trio of magnitudes A2, M2, and the same F, any other trio can be legal if and only if the acceleration ratio between A1 and A2 is the inverse of the mass ratio between M1 and M2. In other words, that if you've got the same force strength, then the only way that that you could have a different acceleration and a different mass would be if the relation between the first acceleration and the second, whatever mass ratio or whatever acceleration ratio that is the inverse of the mass ratio between the first mass and the second. Kind of a weird way of putting it. It should hopefully, when you think about it for a second, be clear that this is just capturing what it would mean for to say that all of the instances of legal that have the same force strength are such that the mass values and the acceleration values are inversely proportional to one another. And so this is also should hopefully make it clear why these proportionality relations have to obtain at the level of the determinable quantity, because they have to do with these relationships between general versions of these magnitudes. Great. So what these relations serve to do is kind of spread the legal relation. Once we have an instance, right, this is a, this whole thing is a conditional starting with one positive instance of the legal relation. But once we have one of those, we're able to spread the legal relation to, using those ratio structures to all the other values of those quantities. And so if we've understood that, then we can now understand in a much simpler way what a law is, because F equals ma is just going to be a conjunction of four things, three of which are proportionality relations, and one is a positive instance of legal. So the proportionality relations, acceleration is inversely proportional to mass, acceleration is proportional to force, and force is proportional to mass. And the only other content to F equals ma on this account is an existential claim that there exists at least one legal instance of F equals ma. So I might be running out of time, so let me just hurry. Okay. Well, we did start a little late, but we'll see. So because of how the proportionality relations spread legal over this domain, you only need to posit one to kind of get the whole thing going. So I refer to this as priming the pump. There are three worries you might have about this view. One is the idea that the way that we're priming the pump was with kind of an arbitrary positive instance of legal. You might think it's kind of weird that our fundamental account of laws involves just like picking one specific one specific instance or kind of instance as our like go-to, and everything's spreading from there, but it doesn't matter which one we pick. You might worry about a couple other things, including one that will be talked about in the comments. So I'll just look at the arbitrariness worry here. So a positive instance of legal is required for the laws to get off the ground, but you only need one, and it doesn't matter which one you pick, because once you pick that one, it will propagate out to all of them. Which specific instance you pick doesn't matter. How could it possibly be that this kind of arbitrary choice is one of the fundamental facts? Does that mean it's one for every possible choice? The way that we can avoid the arbitrariness worry is change what we think of as the like force behind this existential claim. So we cannot, however, make this change by just taking the existential claim to be a fundamental posit. To make an existential claim a fundamental posit would amount to just making it not being existential. Whatever an existential is, it's something that is grounded by some particular instance. However, we can replace this arbitrariness with a mild redundancy, where what we need to say is that there is a mass value for each acceleration force pair, which together produces a legal instance. So we're now, instead of saying there exists this one particular instance and generating out of that, we'll say that there exists a unique mass instance for every acceleration force pair. And in doing so, we're saying more, making more existential claims, but we're still only making them at the level of, but now we're making them in a way where the grounding, the things that would ground or make true this universal generalization and that existential are no longer having arbitrary choices to them. There are a couple other reasons that we might get into in the comments as to why you might want this one-to-one principle. There are a bunch of bad reasons as to why we might want a positive fundamental existential, or it's not clear exactly what it even counts as in it, whether it even counts as an existential anymore. But there are some ways we could try to fix this, which is that instead of having all of this redundancy, or treating it as a fundamental claim about the existence of these particular things, instead treat it as an analysis of what it means for there to exist mass magnitudes at all. So here, instead of one-to-one just describing, just being a sort of more complicated existential to assume, now this one-to-one thing that says there exists a unique mass for every acceleration force pair such that that trio is legal, is now, should not be read as an existential claim, but is rather an account of the grounding conditions for the existence of any mass magnitudes at all. That is to say, we should be reading one-to-one as, for every acceleration force pair, let there be a magnitude such that that pair together with this magnitude satisfy legal, right? So that what we're doing is giving an account of the existence conditions of mass magnitudes, namely that there are exactly as many of them to correspond to each acceleration force pair, and to do more. This will mean that we're no longer being redundant. We now need every instance of one-to-one in order to give an account of where all the mass magnitudes come from. There are other reasons why you might want to do this, but I think I've already gone a little over time, so I'll stop here. On this improved version of the view, we think of the law as a conjunction of the right proportionality relations and this one-to-one condition, rather than having that existential in there. So this is the final pass version of the view. Great. And so I'll stop here, and I'll just mention a couple benefits and then stop. On this account, F equals MA is something that connects determinable quantities. We can interpret one-to-one as an account of what it is in virtue of which mass magnitudes exist at all. Mass is in some sense a quantity that just measures something about an object's relation to this law, something like its inertia. And so F equals MA connects big M mass, big A acceleration, and big F force. This has the unique feature that it gives us a strong metaphysical reason to take the determinable quantity is more fundamental than the determinate, which is a little wacky. And so the latter two, acceleration and force, bring their magnitudes with them, but mass does not. Mass comes alone as a determinable, and it's what determinants it has are determined by the law and the other relation. Great. This account I defend is not a DTA account. It has this primitivist assumption, but it does capture, I think, the spirit of these laws, which is that its explanatory force is coming from the ways in which the laws are relations between properties, in this case, quantities. Even though there is a primitivist assumption at the heart of this, the explanatory force doesn't come from the connection to the world of the primitivist assumption, which is, again, how the legal relation works. The explanatory force of this account of laws doesn't come from that assumption. It instead comes from the account of how the legal relation is distributed in the world. And that is where we get the explanatory value of the DTA account to come back without invoking the quietism problem. Great. I think it's got a bunch of other benefits we won't get into, but yeah, great. That's where we're going a little bit. I'm assuming that the noise cancelings are really good, and the thunderous applause was cut out by that. I don't think things are good. Or the second part, and permanent, yeah.
Okay, that's good.
Okay.
Hi. I can't see you, but I assume you can see me. I want to apologize. I have a tremor when I hold things, and I thought I would be using my hand, but I'll try to read this. Okay, so I think that's a really interesting paper. Thanks, Lee. I really enjoyed it. I really like a few things about it. I like that it's really ambitious, really new accounts of laws, but also where it's embedded in previous primitivist and DTA type accounts is really cool. And I like how it builds the quantitative nature of laws in from the start, right? That's really cool. If you look at Armstrong, he completely ignores that, and then, I think it's in the second last chapter or the last chapter where he tries to smuggle that in. So I think this is really great. I really like it. My concerns, I have a couple, right? So the first one is, I think the big reason the big thing you said about how this improves on the views that are out there is that the DTA account tries to explain laws, but ultimately fails to because of the inference problem. Primitivist accounts don't try at all, right? They essentially give up. And what your account is supposed to do is deliver on the explanatory ambitions of the DTA accounts, and so avoid both giving up and failing in the way DTA accounts do. And I think you do a really clear job of explaining how that works with pickiness and universality, but you also noted a bunch of ways in which DTA accounts wanted to explain other features of laws, like their modal force and their explanatory force, and the way they ground counterfactuals. And it wasn't clear to me that the account could do that, especially given the way it builds in a primitive governing connection, which is really the key points of connection between laws and concrete goings-on or concrete reality. I wondered whether the way that primitive governing is built in at that point leads to a failure to do a lot of the explanatory work that DTA accounts were intended to do. And so I'd like to hear more about that. Whether you think the account can do that work, and if so, how? And then the second concern was that the view seemed really, it seems to come with a lot of baggage, right? It seems quite costly, so there's a lot of ideological, especially, and probably ontological commitments there. there are various relations, both at the determinate level and the level of determinable quantities. And then there's a primitive governing connection as well. It seems more costly than traditional DTA type accounts, right? So when you put that together with what seems to me like a reduced capacity to explain what DTA accounts wanted to explain, I get a little bit worried about whether this is a really costly position that doesn't do as much work as standard DTA accounts wanted to do. And I think that's an interesting, right, so you want to build in, you want to sort of merge primitivist views with DTA type views, but I'm worried about whether the way in which that happens simultaneously undermines the theoretical work that the position can do while also generating a particularly costly set of commitments, especially ideologically, but probably ontologically as well. And that is obviously a worrying outcome. I suspect you can say things about that and work on it, but I think it's a concern about the project of integrating a primitivist view with this kind of somewhat complex DTA view that tries to accommodate the quantitative nature of laws at the same time, that it's going to leave you with a view that is unusually costly while not being able to do as much theoretical work as you'd like the DTA to do. As I said at the start, I think it's a really cool view, I think it's a really cool project, and those are intended very much as friendly comments. Thanks again, cool paper. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Do I are we going to comments or do I get to say it?
Yes, if you want to react, you can.
Sure. So thanks so much for these comments. This was really, really helpful. So you make 2 points that both of which I think are really good questions to ask. The first is about the different kinds of roles that the laws play and whether or not this account is kind of limited to capturing only what I call the universality and pickiness of laws versus the many other things we have to do, like explain counterfactuals, they serve roles in prediction, and they have modal content and all of this other stuff. One way of understanding this is that, again, because it is a synthesis of the DTA and primitivist accounts, is that really it has a relationship to explaining how laws play the roles that they do that is a little closer to a primitivist one, which I think is actually, this way of understanding it is one that I think maybe we should treat all of our metaphysics of laws as trying to do, which is that nobody here is thinking that the law we're stipulating, none of the primitivists think that they're going to stipulate that there is some sui generis entity that has the conjunction of properties, that it governs the evolution of the world, and it has this modal force, and it explains counterfactuals and counterfactual reasonings, and that like all of those things are relatively independent. And so what happens with these primitivist accounts, if you look at sort of Maudlin as a good example of this, is that they pick one or maybe one or two and hone in on those, and then they treat the remaining roles as something that gets an analysis. So Maudlin's example is very clear of this, where he very clearly picks evolution of the physical state, and then explains things like counterfactuals by saying, grant us sort of an account of what counterfactuals are in general, and then we'll explain how the existence of the laws that govern the physical state as entities in the world will be able to give rise to the right kind of counterfactual reasoning that you would expect would hold because of those. And so the hope for this kind of account is that it would be able to do a similar thing, that it gives you a pretty narrow governing assumption with this account of how the legal relation makes contact with the world, and then from that we get these other roles like its modal force, the grounding counterfactuals, its explanatory force, predictive force, and all these other things from from that core assumption via an analysis of what role those laws are playing in the world. The second point was about the sort of high cost, which is that it is, I mean, another way you might put it, which is what is super complex. And it seems like why would you bother having something so weird and complex? One way of understanding what's happening here is that all of that section 2 theoretical building blocks, those things are basically giving you an account of, I know I said before that it wasn't giving you just an NFP account with some extra bells and whistles, but you can think of it in some sense, all of part 2 is just giving you a more physically realistic version of the end relation. Right, where the characteristic instance template is standing in for the end relation, all it has is co-instantiation. Well, the characteristic instance template says, well, all the laws talk about different things, and so instead of co-instantiation, we have to say co-instantiation within this particular event with this particular characteristics, namely like a massive object being pressed with a force and accelerating. And then the legal relation just tells you if this new version of the end relation holds. So taken together to just give you what the end relation does. The only difference is that those two things on their own give you almost none of what makes the laws tick. Right? They just give you the sort of basics of how the laws make contact with the world. And so this is the benefit of this account and also why it is as complex as it is, which is that it's the explanatory force of the DTA account and the way it's able to get past that quietus dilemma is because all of the ways that it explains what laws are like and how they act the way they do comes via this account of laws as proportionality relations. And that account is separate from the story about how those laws make contact with the world. And it is only the bit in part 2 that actually has the governing assumption in there. And because of that, the governing assumption, while closely related to what's happening involved with the proportionality relations, is not the thing doing the work in these explanations. And so the metaphysical structures that have been added can't be easily picked away. For some of the other things, like the one-to-one relation, some of that complexity comes from the fact that I think there are some benefits to having the one-to-one relation, which is that lets us get what I call a nomological theory of mass. So we can get an account of mass itself and mass's structure in terms of how the mass determinants connect up with the laws, and so we'll be able to get some additional explanatory benefit from some of that complexity, which is one of the reasons it looks the way it does. So I hope that that's... Oh, okay, great. Thank you. Great comments. Done.
Thank you. So I have 10 minutes for questions. Please keep your hands up. Hi, it's Vera here. I would like to hear more about the direction of determination between the laws of nature, the laws of nature as relations between determinables, and the relations between the determinate quantities. Because I felt, but I might be wrong, that there was a kind of tension. So at a certain point you said that laws of nature are such in virtue of the fact that the relations between determinate always hold, or something like that, and on the other hand, you were still endorsing the view that laws of nature govern the instances. Thank you.
Great. Good question, and I understand the point. I'm just trying to think of a good place to pull up that. So what's happening with these laws as proportionality relations is that what they say is that the proportionality relations themselves are understood as relations between the determinable quantities, and then what they actually say is things about what the determinants of those determinable quantities must be like, and how they must feature in the legal relation. And many of these things are sort of fixed by those structures, one of the reasons why this doesn't run into, I think maybe you're suggesting like the kind of circularity that you might see or that people accuse Humeans of having, where the thing that explains the laws is also what the laws are supposed to explain, is that on this account, the laws are not intended to explain where these ratio relations come from. Let's set aside for a minute the like nomological account of mass that's sort of working in a slightly different way. But it's not meant to explain why these quantities and their determinants are the way they are. It is functioning as just a way to explain how the legal relation is instantiated in the world. Or more accurately, like how it's instantiated for all of the possible ways of saturating the characteristic instance template with a force, acceleration, and mass. But so that's the reason why it's not going to run into that is that the thing that's actually being explained is pretty narrow, and then the governing assumption is just at the level of that relation, that legal relation that is very downstream of all of the explanatory benefits we're getting from this account of laws as relations between quantities. I hope that helps.
Thanks, Ian. Thanks for that. Quick question about kind of the account of mass, nomological mass. Why might we want to prefer a nomological amount of mass to a nomological amount of force? It seems like we could have given instead. We can't maybe give them both, but we could have given either. Is it just these like different theories then, or is there some like reason I haven't seen why mass is like the best candidate to have a nomological account of it?
Great. So that's a good question, and there's nothing that what I've said here actually tells you why you would want mass to be the thing that gets its structure from the laws. Some of this comes from the fact that this does capture a belief that people have had about mass, that mass is in some sense nothing but the measure of inertia. While certainly there are quantities here that whose structure seems to be very much independent of these laws. Acceleration we think of as having a clear analysis in terms of other quantities, spatiotemporal quantities that that is less of a that we don't think of as being relevant there. Likewise, insofar as force is as the quantity of force is one that we might want to give this kind of nomological account of. That might be the kind of thing you would give to a force law. But roughly it's like, there's not a super principled reason that forces us there, other than that there are kind of independent reasons why people have thought that our accounts of a given quantity might go this way. And there are reasons, as you, I think, picked up on, that there's only one that there turns out to be like, you can only really do this for one before the account loses its ability to do all of the cool formal stuff it was doing. And so, given that you have to pick one, it mostly will come down to whether there's something whether one of those quantities can be considered in some sense just a measure of something about how one engages with the law, whether it's the right kind of like coupling constant for whatever influence the law is encoding. And if you get something like that, then that's why you might want that. Why would you want one in general? There are a bunch of reasons. If you think that certain quantities, like spatiotemporal ones, and you might be able to give it a spatiotemporal account of force, are fundamental, and that things like mass and charge are derivative. This would give you a way of understanding how those things could be derivative. Okay, all right, but I think that.
Hey Z, thanks for a super interesting talk. I found your discussion of the inference problem really insightful. Just can't this way. And I just kind of wondered how can you say a little bit more about how your view gets around the dilemma you pose for quietism? So I was wondering if it was, if the way it does it is because the sort of stipulation that only like legal instances are actual, is it that the fact that that's built into the characterization of the legal relation that allows you to get around the dilemma? Or is it something to do with the fact that the legal relation holds between like determinants or instances, which is unlike the way Armstrong's relation works, since it holds between universals, and it's kind of mysterious how it filters down to the instances. So if you could say a little bit more about that, that would be great.
Certainly. So if I were to give a longer version of this, I would come back to the quiet revenge and talk about sort of where this dilemma breaks down that we might not have seen. And the place it breaks down is in the quietism horn. The quietism horn, as I wrote it out here, is if n, which is some metaphysical gadget we're adding to our primitive view, if that metaphysical gadget is not part of explaining how the laws govern, then n is just an extraneous metaphysical bit of window dressing. That conditional, it turns out, is false. There are ways that n cannot be a part of explaining how the laws govern while still having a explanatory role. So basically what's going on is that the laws as proportionality relations are not part of explaining how the laws govern. The governing account, as you saw in that presentation, happens really early, right? Like I tell you, like here's what it is for the laws to govern. It's for legal to hold, and when legal holds, that just means that then any instance of the characteristic instance template, any event that would be that matches that must also be one that satisfies legal. That's the full account of what it is for these laws to govern. Is that all of the events must be legal, to be a way you might sloganize it. That's what it means for the laws to govern. Isn't that nice? But everything about, well, when does legal hold, completely unanswered here. And so the reason why this new metaphysical gadget, these laws of proportionality relations, all of that stuff still has explanatory force, and in particular, of course, explanatory force in explaining what it is that laws are like and why they play the roles that they do, comes from the fact that that's not explaining how they govern. The governing story is already done. But the governing story depends on the legal relation holding in a particular instance, and what these extra window dressing does is tell you when that relation holds. And so they're just telling you the distribution of this relation, the same way that that you could have easily gotten the same kind of result by just having a really, really, really long list of legal. I mean, we continuum, many long lists, a very long list. But of every single legal instance of the legal relations, or every legal trio of acceleration, force, and mass, and that would amount to the same thing at the level of governing as this does. But it would be one that feels deeply unexplanatory, because you have this long list kind of introduced fundamentally. You want to know why does this particular infinite list of relations hold? You've got no answer if it's fundamental. And so there is an explanatory benefit to having an account which churns out the perfect distribution of legal relations. And once it does that, that's its explanatory contribution, and that explanatory contribution is separate from the account of how the laws govern. So that's where the break was happening, and that's how you get out of here. It's basically that it turns out you can take the antecedent of quietism without running into the consequence.
Okay, great. So let's thank the